Hey everybody, and welcome to Epic Everyday, our weekday podcast for busy, stressed out Christians who want to really thrive and not just be an overwhelmed, stressed out land, less than land every stinking day.
Yeah, who want to live in the real world.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes we get stuck in this idea that life is just hard, especially as Christians.
Yeah.
Which is actually something we're going to talk about today and this week.
Right.
But we get stuck in the idea that things are one misery after another. And then it kind of reminds me of the American value of retirement. Like, we have such a value on retirement that we work this job that you hate and sucks your life until you get to be 65. And then, yay, you retire and you're free and you can do whatever you love doing. And I think sometimes that's how we view our lives, that living on the earth is the job that you hate, and then having, the new heaven and the new earth and being in our new bodies and all that kind of stuff is like retirement. But that's not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus said the kingdom of God is among you. So, speaking of himself.
Yeah, there's some pretty awesome stuff we can do now. We can live in joy and peace and abundance. Not necessarily like, oh, I have $1 million, but in, that internal freedom. It's just so amazing. This week, we are talking about gentleness. And since it's Tuesday, the CSC for today is surrender.
So we're going to talk about surrendering to God's judgments and God's ways, which is a major part of gentleness. I'm
just going to read this definition again for Prayates.
Yeah, I think we better do that because we need to let it soak in. It's a hefty definition.
Yeah, it's out of Galatians 5. So where the fruit of the Spirit is, this is the word that's used for gentleness there. Meekness, mildness, forbearance. Primarily, it does not denote outward expression of feeling, but an inward grace of the soul, calmness toward God in particular. It is the acceptance of God's dealings with us, considering them as good in that they enhance the closeness of our relationship with Him. However, Prayates encompasses expressing wrath toward the sin of man, as demonstrated by the Lord Jesus. This meekness does not blame God for the persecutions and evil doings of men. It is not the result of weakness, but the activity of the blessedness that exists in one's heart from being actively angry at evil. That virtue that stands between two extremes, uncontrollable and unjustified anger, and not becoming angry at all no matter what takes place around you. So we talked about anger yesterday. So today we thought we'd talk about that complete surrender to God's will, the acceptance of God's dealings with us, considering them as good in that they enhance the closeness of our relationship with Him.
Yeah. So I had a question for you.
Okay.
What do you think's more painful and causes more strife with your relationship with God, I guess? Confusion about what God's plan even is, like when we feel like we're in the dark about it and we know He's doing something and it's like, oh, what are your ways, God? Why this situation? Why that? Or kind of getting a glimpse of it and seeing things that we don't agree with, like, that's not going to work, God, or some of the like, oh, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Like some of these ways of God's that are that part
just don't make sense.
And you're like, what? But I think that's kind of what we're talking about today, where it's like we're accepting both and we're walking with God in faith in both of those uncomfortable situations.
Yeah, I'm not really sure which one is harder for me.
Worse. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're harder at different times. Like, Psalm, what is it? It's one of the 70s. Where Asaph goes on the whole, like, why are evil men prospering? Right. And I think that is hard for me sometimes.
Me too.
Then there are verses in Proverbs that talk about how the wicked store up wealth for God so that He can redistribute it to the righteous. And I really love that verse because it's just like, oh yeah, okay, so that means that God's allowing the wicked to prosper so that He can then prosper the righteous. Not because He's like, oh yeah, I'm totally approving of what you're doing,
Sure. Yeah. So in that case, you can kind of get the glimpse of both sides of that, but it's still hard to be in the moment and waiting and being like, in the middle of some hard situation. And it's like, well, God, why does this take so long? Or why does that guy over there get that thing?
I definitely, being sick and just watching it take forever to get healthy has been hard. But, I mean, I am super blessed in that God has, put me on a path of natural health and gotten me out of a wheelchair. And, I mean, I've made tons of progress. So
Yeah.
I feel like I shouldn't be complaining because I'm like, oh, man, I'm so much healthier than some of my friends that have autoimmune and are just getting sicker. So,
Yeah. And I think the older we get, ideally, the more we see that God knows what he's doing.
yeah.
And it should get easier. But every new situation, I know I always struggle with. Mine is the confusion about the stuff I don't know. Like that drives me so nuts.
Yeah.
And I feel like, even if I'm leading a prayer at church, it's always creeping in there. It's like, I'm going to pray for healing for the people in our congregation or whatever. God resolve this situation. And then I'm right in the place of like, and increase our faith, because we don't know what you're doing and we don't really see why we have to go through all this, and it's really hard.
Right.
And so please help increase our faith. Like it
is hard.
And that confusion about like, why is this? I believe that this is the right way because you're sovereign. That's why I love that quote from the book of the Dun Cow. Chanticleer is, he's gone through a tragedy and he's praying to God. And this is by Walter Wangerin Jr., the book of the Dun Cow. It's my favorite book.
Sorrows.
No, it's in the first book.
Oh, okay.
But Chanticleer says, what's so important in his sight that it has to be done this way? And so there's faith there. There's also doubt and frustration and anger.
Yeah,
but it's in a prayer, so there's surrender there too.
Right.
I just love that.
That is awesome.
I struggle with that all the time.
Yeah, and there is several Bible studies that I've done. Beth Moore talks about this a lot, that like, however difficult it is, God's building a more than equal amount of blessing. And so it's just like, okay, well, so this was 100 hard. Well, you get 150 blessing, whatever, on a scale of 1 to 100.
I don't like that.
It's 100 hard.
Yeah, that's pretty hard.
Yeah. It's past 10.
Yeah.
Far past 10. Sometimes that's how I feel like things are,
Oh, yeah.
But I think it is really hard when we talk about submission. I mean, we live in a culture that is all about rugged individualism and not about submission. Submission feels wussy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was another great line from something we were reading about gentleness, where it was like, what was it? Oh, the line is, giving in doesn't mean losing.
Yeah.
And that's not a cultural truth for us.
No.
Giving in does mean losing.
Right.
But it doesn't. Being gentle, it's kind of like when we were talking about patience, having the ability to exact revenge or justice or something, but withholding.
Right.
This is a similar thing where it's like, you have this power. God's made you a person with free will and created in God's image, so you could run around the world and exact all kinds of change. But not doing that and using your strength to connect with God is better.
Right. I actually was thinking about, we've been watching this documentary this last week and talking about it, how the 50s were.
Yeah.
I don't know, it was on YouTube. You would know where, you were the one that was like, hey, let's watch it.
Yeah. It was very interesting though. There's what were you thinking about? Like there were these propaganda films for teenagers about how to act. That was the part that got me, but maybe you're thinking about something else.
I was just thinking about how they were like, submit. And so then, kind of, and I know I have this in my life because there were people who told me to submit to evil things. And so because of that, when I think of submission, my first thought is like, no, it makes me feel like sick inside.
It's a warning signal. Yeah.
Right. As soon as it's like, oh, you're trying to brainwash me, So, yeah. And I loved how in that film they talked about how the 60s, the revolution came out of all the suppression of the 50s. And so... Yeah,
that was an interesting connection.
I love that Christian submission is so different because I think that's what we think of in our culture when we talk about submission. Even in the debate between men and women, when it talks about women submit, we think that means, like I have to do whatever you tell me to do, and
you don't have a voice
well,
anymore.
men think that. But that you're taking away the rights rather than that I'm choosing to surrender my rights.
Yeah, I mean, if it's something God's asking us to do, it's going to enhance our life. It's going to be good for us, even if we don't understand it. We want to understand it and then obey, or obey and then understand it.
Yeah, obey and then understand it feels like most of the time. Beth Moore has this great quote in her Living Beyond Yourself study on the week on gentleness. It's page 178. She says, meekness or gentleness is the power and strength created from submitting to God's will. Gentleness is responsibility with power. And it kind of made me laugh, actually, because the note that I have next to it is the force that comes from dropping your weight down. So I was like, okay.
That's the Tai Chi thing.
Lots of Tai Chi stuff already in there. That was, I don't know, several years ago that I wrote that in there. But, there is a force that comes from dropping your weight down. It's crazy because you almost have to, I know it takes a lot of practice to experience it, but it is like dropping a rubber ball on the floor. You drop a rubber ball on the floor and instantly it bounces back up. Mm-hmm. And when we drop our weight down, when we do the work of surrender, when we, drop down into this is God's will, there's a power that comes out of that.
Yeah, I know. And the tendency is to fight like they do in the movies where you're overreaching all the time and like you're not,
so much work.
Right. I mean, it looks cool, but we've been conditioned to think it looks cool.
I was going to say, only if you don't know anything about fighting. Otherwise, you're like, oh my goodness, that is, not going to work.
Yeah.
Even my kids can pull out which parts don't work.
Yeah. So what we're really talking about here is this transfer of power. We're transferring our power. We're surrendering it to God. And then through us, he is doing these amazing things.
Right.
Through us, he can do goodness and gentleness, and we just get to watch. It's amazing.
Right. Well, and I think, we forget that we surrender to all kinds of stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. We submit. If we hire somebody to plan us a vacation and then they're like, here's the plan, here's your tickets, here's where you're staying and all that stuff, we totally submit to that. Yeah. And honestly, if somebody was like, hey, I planned you a vacation and I'm paying for it, here you go, which is what God does, I'd be like, heck yeah, sign me up for that, Right. But that's... Yeah,
submit's not a bad word.
Right. Yeah. It just is in my brain. I have to get over that. Something I've worked on for a long time.
I think a lot of men and women struggle with that because it seems like you're saying I'm your slave now. And who wants that?
Right. But it's totally not.
Yeah.
Submission is common. We don't even recognize it. But it's that choice to do what is important to someone else, even when it may not necessarily be our first choice. Mm-hmm. We do it all the time in relationships. We do it when we go to a job and, do what our boss tells us to do.
Yeah. And we must do it with God because we don't understand these concepts. We don't understand real gentleness and real goodness and real patience. And so we constantly have to give over to him that bad understanding and ask him to teach us.
As always, pick whether today is going to be awesome or not, whether you're going to strengthen those neural pathways to look for awesomeness in your life, or if you're going to strengthen those neural pathways to look for misery, because whatever you look for, that is what you will find.
Yeah, practice makes perfect. I mean, you can get pretty good at...
being miserable?
Yeah, finding the gray clouds instead of the silver lining.
Yeah, we have definitely had some people in our lives that they're just miserable for decades. And you're like, dang, don't you ever want to change and grow and move past that? There's a lot more to life than that. But yeah. So pick what you're going to do because you have a choice. Mm-hmm. We love you guys and we are praying for you. Thanks to you that have been sharing the show and listening to the show. We really appreciate it. If you did find this episode helpful, please do share it with people. And come back tomorrow, and we are going to talk about humility. It's going to be great, because this is another one of those concepts where,
it's a big one.
God totally turned this upside down for me, growing up in a very strict kind of church. had some pretty negative connotations with humility. So if you're one of those kinds of people that's like, I hate humility, come back tomorrow.
Yeah. We'll sort it all out in 10 minutes, I'm sure.
Whatever. But it'll at least give you some stuff to think about.
That's right.
All right.
Look forward to it.
Have an awesome Tuesday, you guys.